always go back to this because driving is my patience builder. You're driving down the road and that person cuts you off. Sometimes the reaction I have is not really one that's going to make people glorify God. That's not where my mind goes, because I'm a human being and I've been praying about it, y'all. So if you see me doing it, understand I'm in there praying. I am trying. I really am. I'm working on it, because we all need to. But we all have our things. That might not bother you. You might be the easiest driver. That's great. I could learn from you. But there might be some other areas in your life where there's that thing that happens and you think, man, I need to bring praise to God. I need to bring glory to him. But sometimes people, but that's our purpose. And that's why, but again, that's why you have this identity, and that's why you're called into this people. That's why God doesn't call you to just be out there by yourself. You're called into a community. You're called into a group. And so I may not struggle with some things. I struggle, like I said, with that driving thing. You might not. That's why God brings us together and we're part of a group. Because you might be able to say, hey, you know what? This is something I do and that might help me. So we work together. And then our last thing he gives us here is a reason. And I love that. He's called us because he called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's a pretty great thing. He called you. I love that concept. Because it doesn't matter where you are when you're called. He still calls. He called before you were born because there was an idea. And he's called you ever since. I know so many people who tell me, I didn't come into church. I came in later in life, but there was something in my life. I just felt like there was something drawing me. And we see that a lot. There are places where people who have had no exposure to Bibles, there's something that calls them. Sister Vannie Marshall, I love her testimony because she talks about she came into the church a lot later in life. She was a Hindu priestess, a Hindu temple dancer. And there was something in God that was always calling her. And when she said that she learned the names of every single God out there, but none of them were healing her body. None of them were fixing her marriage. None of them were giving her peace. And when she learned the name Jesus, she said, if you are who you say you are, I'm going to ask you to do these things, to heal my body, to save my marriage, and then I will serve you for the rest of my life. And he did, and she has, and she's been an incredible testimony. She's an amazing person, but there was a calling there because he called her from the time that she was born. Even though she was in a completely different set of beliefs, he still called. And there was something in the soul that responds to that. So, but I want to look a little bit at some of the things that keep us from walking into that calling, because I think we love the idea of being called, but sometimes all of the things connected to that, we get a little bit nervous. So I want to tell you about some people that have been called losers, because that's a very common word. I want you to see if you can think about who I'm talking about here. You might know him, so see if you know. I'm going to tell you at the end. Anybody heard of Paul Harvey? I was a Paul Harvey fan. Paul Harvey's big thing was, this is the rest of the story. And now you know the rest of the story. And I'm sick, so my voice is getting that deep. We'll see. It might get there eventually, but that was his big thing. So he tell you the story and you hear at the end. So that's what I'm gonna attempt that, but I'm not Paul Harvey. So this guy, he first went into politics at the age of 23. He campaigned for a seat on the Illinois General Assembly and he failed. He opened a general store and he failed after a few months. It fell apart. Then he failed in business 2 more times and he failed in campaigning 6 more times. He went to war as a captain, but then he received demotions until he came home as a private. So that was the label. That was the thing that he lived under. But he became something else. Anybody know who that might be? This was Abraham Lincoln. So he failed several times. He was a loser for so long in people's eyes. But he was called to be more. He was called to do more, and he did. The next one, I love this one. This is one of my other personal heroes. This man, you'll know who he is when I tell you. He did not speak until he was 4 years old. He didn't read until he was 7. His parents thought he was subnormal. He was expelled from school. His teachers described him as mentally slow and antisocial. He was refused admission into the Zurich Polytechnic School. But he went on to do some great things. That was Albert Einstein. She knew. Albert Einstein's another hero of mine. It's another one I love. Figure. He struggled in school and failed the 6th grade. So if anybody failed 6th grade, you're in good company. People who fail 6th grade do good things. We don't have 6th grade teachers, right? Sister Donna, did you teach? She didn't teach 6th grade, so we're safe. We're okay. All right. So that one you can do. No, I'm kidding. Kids don't fail 6th grade. Just work on it. All right. He struggled in school, failed 6th grade. After school, he tried to go into politics. He failed several times. He lost every single political election he ever ran in, even though he was a politician all his life, until he was well into his 60s. So he didn't really, nobody saw him as even remotely successful until he was in his 60s. I'll give you a hint. He was English. And this was Winston Churchill. Next one. Thomas, I already told you who he is. Well, his first name is Thomas. You might figure out the rest. His teachers told him he was too stupid to learn anything. He was judged as a pyromaniac because he was into fire. He was fired from his last 2 jobs for not being productive. He tried to create something grand but failed hundreds of times. He's quoted as saying, "I have not failed 700 times. I have succeeded in proving that these 700 ways will not work." That is an optimist. When I've eliminated the ways that will not work, I will find the way that will work. And so his first name was Thomas. You might have guessed his name was Edison. Yeah, Thomas Edison. And then this is another one that I think y'all will know him. He was fired by a newspaper editor because, I love this, he lacked imagination and had no good ideas. He then started over 6 businesses that ended in failure. He declared bankruptcy 7 times. He lived in a dingy apartment where his only friend was a little mouse that he shared his meals with. Anybody have any idea who that might be? The mouse is a clue. Today we know him as Walt Disney. He shared his meals with a little mouse, and that gave him the inspiration for a character called Mickey that later defined his life. But these were people who failure defined them for so long. It would have been so easy for them to say, "I've messed up," or "I've lived in this particular place for so long, I might as well just stay because I keep messing up. I feel like I've been called for something greater. I feel like I'm supposed to do something greater, but I don't know how to get out of this." But they kept going. Edison's whole thing, 700 times. I probably would have given up after about 5. A lot of us probably would have. But if we look in the Bible, God has a way of calling people and not dwelling on that. Peter in the Bible was kind of a hothead. He didn't have a prestigious job. He was uneducated. He made promises he couldn't keep. He hacked off a soldier's ear in a fit of rage. That's quite a story. But God did something with Peter. And Peter, I think, is such a great example. He felt like he was a failure so many times, but God just kept reaching. God just kept gently calling. And Peter came into something incredible. Rahab in the Bible was a harlot. She was an outcast because of, her life and everything, but because of her faith and what she did, she's listed not only as a biblical hero, but in the lineage of Jesus. That's probably one of the greatest honors you could have. I love that too. There were, in the lineage of Jesus, you see Rahab, who not only by her lifestyle, but she was also from a pagan group. She was not even part of the community. You also see Ruth, who was a Moabitess. And the Bible the Old Testament has some very strict words to say about association with people from Moab because of their origins. But God keeps using people despite all of it. David wasn't the first choice by anybody in society. We know that. I love that story. There's a song that I love to sing. It's called Shepherd Boy, that whenever others see a shepherd boy, God can see a king. It's a beautiful song, but he wasn't even called in. Jesse didn't even consider him worthy enough to stand with his other sons, but yet God saw something else there. It was from Jesse's place of weakness that Israel's victory came. That's a great thing. Sometimes it's from your greatest weaknesses in life you're going to see your greatest victories, because God knows how to do that. It's in those weaknesses a lot of times because that's where we're made strong, because he says that's in that place of weakness, that's where you're not relying on you. That's where you're going to have to rely on me. So a lot of times we'll see that from our greatest trials and our greatest weakness, God will take that and he'll turn it into one of the greatest victories you can have. I kind of want to look here at Moses, because I think Moses is such an awesome example of this whole process. In Exodus 3:1, we see where Moses, his whole story, I kind of think the majority of his story really begins here. Moses had lived quite a life up until this. Moses was 80 at this point. So too, I always think that's very encouraging. Churchill began his major work in his 60s. But what a thing he did, even though he didn't get to do it earlier. Had Churchill not done what he did, England would have been overrun by Nazis. Our world would have been very different. Had England not been able to hold up in the 40s, our world would be a very different place. But God knew for such a time as this, he put the right person in place. Moses, to me, is a very similar figure in this way. Because in his 40s, up until he was 40, he worked. He tried to fix everything on his own. It didn't work out. He wasn't only a misfit, but he was a murderer. He ran for his life. He'd spent another 40 years in the desert with sheep. So it's at 80 that he receives this great calling. So it says he was in the backside of the desert. He was keeping his father-in-law's flock. He was doing his job. And then he goes up into the mountains and he sees the bush that is burning but not consumed. And he goes up there. And I think it's interesting that the Bible says in Exodus 3, and when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called him out of the midst of the bush. So first of all, God was watching to see if he would turn aside. Because the calling was already there. He was ready to do this. But he wanted to see, first of all, if Moses was going to turn aside. Moses could have walked on by. He probably had walked by that bush a lot of times. Granted, it probably wasn't on fire the other times, but he'd walked in that area. He knew it. But God wanted to see, are you going to turn aside? Are you ready for something different? And so he wanted to see that Moses was capable of recognizing the moment for what it was and walking into it. And so I love this. Jehovah Jireh, the term, the Lord who sees, or God will see to it. He sees the afflictions of his people. So Moses turns aside and he says, here am I. And then God gives him the call and he says, I've seen the afflictions of my people. I want you to go deliver them. And we know that part of the story. But Moses, in this point, he basically gives God 4 excuses, 4 reasons not to walk into that calling. And so he starts out, the first thing that when Moses says unto God, who am I that I should go into Pharaoh, that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? So his first excuse is, who am I? And that, I think, has a lot to do with that, what we've been talking about, how the labels that were put on us. Moses looks at his past. He looks at who he is. He feels unqualified. Why me of all people? I know that you're calling me for something, but are you sure you got the right person? I think a lot of us have been there at some point. God, really? Me? Do you know me? Have you met me? Are you sure you got the right person here? But I love this because Moses, there's a humility here that you see that he learned during those years in the desert. But it kind of went so far that he didn't feel like he could do it anymore. Moses, you got to think about that. 40 years of, they told me I was supposed to do something great and I messed it up. I was supposed to deliver my people, but I killed a guy and I messed everything up. And you got to think there are moments when he was with those sheep that he thought, people over there are getting beaten and it's because I was not good enough to help them. People over there are dying and my people are in bondage because I couldn't do it, because I wasn't good enough, because we tend to do that to ourselves. But it's interesting that Moses was probably the most qualified person to do that job, but Moses didn't see it. God saw it. Moses didn't see it. Moses had been born Hebrew, but he'd been raised in the palace. He knew the inner workings of Egyptian society and of the government. He knew all of it. And he also knew what it meant to be a part of his people. He was a figure right there on the edge. But Moses didn't see it. Sometimes we can be so consumed with our past and things that we've done that it's hard for us to, when he calls us out of darkness, I think we're good at being called out of darkness, but being called into light and all the things that taking on that new identity, being a part of that group, taking on that purpose, that's what can be kind of hard. So Moses' first excuse is, who am I? The second one, in Exodus 3:13, Moses says to God, behold, when I come into the children of Israel, and shall say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me unto you, they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? So his next fear here, his next reason, is a question of authority. He says, who am I going to say sent me? On whose authority am I going? So who am I, then who are you? Because he thought, I want to know that I'm being sent by the right person. A lot of times when God calls us to do something, one of our first things is, but is it really you? Is this really God telling me to do it? Because if it's not, I'm a little bit nervous about that. There's a fear of rejection that was here. And that's a very human thing that we feel, that fear of rejection. God, I don't know if I want to go talk to that person. What if they reject me? What if they say no? We're very afraid of the word no. I'm working with a guy right now. He has a list of, I think it was like 40-something ways to be rejected. And he said he's going to try to incorporate them into his day of constantly asking people stuff that he knows they'll say no to so he can get over his fear of rejection. But that's a commitment right there. That's quite a thing to do. So things like, I think one of them was going up to a person with a plant and asking, can I plant this in your backyard at your house? Because surely they'll say no. I said, but you'll never know what people will say. Sometimes they'll say yes. I probably would say yes, but just understand it's going to die because I can't keep a plant alive. But do your thing. You have fun. But fear of rejection, that keeps us from so much. But that's Moses' next thing. He wants to be sure that it's not just him. I love, the Bible talks about how we're his sheep. And he says that my sheep know my voice. Something that's always given me a lot of peace. I love that concept because if you look at the difference between a sheep and a lamb is still a baby. A lamb needs to be held, and it needs to be cuddled, and it needs to be petted, and it needs a lot more. But a sheep can understand the voice of the shepherd, and he goes. And so I think that's a great sign of spiritual maturity as we start to understand and we learn what his voice sounds like. We begin to hear his voice out of all the clamor around us. Because when we're still getting started, and that's okay when we're in that place, if you're still at the place of being a lamb, because that's how we get there. But at the beginning, that's where we need his presence all the time. We need to feel it, and you hear that a lot. But I don't feel him right now. Sometimes it's because he's training you in those moments to listen to his voice. Sometimes his presence isn't as strong. You don't feel him. You don't feel that embrace the way you used to. But that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes that's because he says, I trust you. I'm leading you further because I want you to know what my voice sounds like. You know the touch of my hand. You know the feeling of that, and that's great. You know what my embrace is. But I want you to know my voice because my sheep know my voice, and I want you to go into deeper things. And so Moses wanted to be sure that the voice he was hearing was the voice of God. The next part, Exodus 4:1, Moses comes back and he says, but God, what if they don't believe me? So he was afraid of who he was, of his past. He was afraid of the authority sending him. And then he was afraid of the response. What if they hate me for it? What if they don't believe me? What if, all of those what ifs. The future can be an uncertain place. Moses was very afraid of what are they going to do? I love, there is a phrase that, not in the Bible, but I think there's something great in it, that the will of God will not take you where the grace of God will not keep you. And that's a pretty thing to say. It's a great thing to put on a t-shirt. It's a lot harder to live. Because when we walk into that, and when you go into that place where the grace of God is the only thing that's keeping you, it's not an easy place to be in. That's that place again where you don't always feel his presence, but you hear his voice. And you've got to rely on that, and you've got to say, God, it's a place of walking absolutely by faith. Because you're in that area and you're thinking, God, I don't feel you. God, I feel all this stuff around me, and I'm trying to stay focused, and I'm tired, and I'm weary, but I know that your grace is sufficient. It's relying on that. But he will send that grace in those moments. Years ago, I was facing a pretty difficult situation. I'd broken off an engagement, and that's a tough thing to do, and I was going through a lot of emotional turmoil, and I was feeling alone. It was a tough time in my life. I kind of look at I lived in the desert and Moses lived in the desert, so I feel like we have something going on there. I think we have something in common. So I look at my desert years a lot like that, but I was in a tough place and I was struggling. But I know that during that time, even though in the moments I felt most alone, God would sometimes he'd send a person. And it wasn't a person who I could rely on every single moment of every day. Sometimes it was an encounter. Sometimes it was one conversation. Never saw that person again, but that one conversation gave me strength to make it through the week. And then the next time, I'd hear a song on the radio, and he would say, I'm with you through this too. And I'd feel him in that moment, and that would keep me a little bit longer. Sometimes we think, God, you've got to send me that one person I can rely on through everything. And sometimes he does, but sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he'll send something into our lives for a season. And there's something about that. And I've come to realize the beauty of a season, of even a friend who's with me for a season. I have a lot of friendships I haven't been able to keep my whole life. But I look back and I think that season they were there, and thank God they were there, because I don't know what I would have done without them. And in that time, but I noticed, I went into a class one day, and I'd been feeling pretty broken all day. I'd been crying, I'd been struggling. And at the end of my class, one of my professor called me up, and she said, Cheri, I don't know what it is about you. She said, but I just, you're always smiling. She's like, where do you get, you're always smiling. And I looked, I kind of felt my face, like, is she right? Am I actually smiling? I didn't feel like I was. And she's like, you have this joy. And I really admire that. And I went back to my car and I thought, how is that possible? But the Bible says he gives joy unspeakable. It was a joy that I couldn't speak. I couldn't explain it. I didn't know where it came from. But it was something that kept me. Because even if response is a scary thing, even if you think, I don't know what's going to happen, I don't know what's going to come to pass if I walk into this place God is calling me to, he knows how to send the grace you need to get through it. You look at Moses, and we kind of look at it through human eyes and think, maybe he was right to be afraid of response. I mean, the people got mad at him every 10 seconds. The stuff that he did, and they were always mad. But what God gave Moses to was a love for those people, that even though he got annoyed with them, that love brought him through a lot of things. He gave him a grace that helped him to hold up through all of it. And then Moses, a little bit later, Moses tries to give every excuse to get out of this that he can. So Exodus 4:10, he says, God, I'm not eloquent. I can't talk. And I think this is interesting because Moses gave all the big excuses. To me, this is kind of like one of those last ditch. I'm going to throw in one more and see if he'll go for it. But he says, God, I can't talk. I'm not eloquent. I stutter. And that's an interesting one because it's a fear based on lack of ability. Sometimes we look at people and think, God, are you sure you want me for this job? Because, Sister so-and-so over there, she's amazing at this. This is like what she does. She's incredible. And God, Sister Donna, she's so creative. What about her? Wouldn't she be the best one for it? But sometimes there's a reason he asked you to do the thing. There's something about you. I think this is interesting because Moses couldn't see his ability here. But I kind of did a little research because I was wondering. But again, Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace. He was raised to be an orator, actually, because in ancient society, if you had a royal education, one of the things you were trained in was rhetoric. You were trained in public speaking. Nobody else in Israel was trained for this job the way Moses was. Moses actually had instruction in how to speak before a pharaoh and how to address a royal group. Nobody else had that training, but Moses did. He was so capable, and he couldn't see it. He was so afraid that this one thing, he couldn't get past it. And this is the one that hung Moses up. He just couldn't. And this is where God said, okay. He was a little bit annoyed with him, but he said, okay, I'm going to send somebody to help you. But he didn't get out of it because God called him out of something and into something else. And Moses went, even with some help. I think this is an interesting thing because I have a friend who, he stutters a lot. And I would notice it's mostly with figures of authority. It would get a little bit worse. But in casual conversation, we'd talk, and he would have trouble getting things out. But God called him to preach, of all the things, because God is not limited by what we perceive to be lack of ability. God called him to preach. And he struggled with that a little because he thought, I stutter. I can't be a preacher, but he did. And he walked into that. And it was so great because we'd watch him get up and lead a service. We'd watch him sing. We'd watch him do stuff. But when he would preach, the stutter would go away. He would be able to speak. And then when he'd stop preaching, he'd talk to us again. It would all be back. But when he would preach, it would all go away because there's something about that. Now, sometimes that's not to say that if that's a thing, God's just going to make everybody who has that, and it's going to go away. You're not going to worry about it. But that was the case for him. But the idea there's something about when God calls you to do something, when he calls you into something, he can give you what you need to get through it. In this case, that was what he needed. My dad, one of my favorite things he talks about is they say a lot when people would ask, Brother Grissom, when you were in Colombia as a missionary, was there ever a time when you were preaching and God just took over and you were speaking and you were speaking perfect Spanish without thinking about it? And he was like, no, never happened, not once. And he said, but I saw moments where I talked like a kindergartner and I babbled and I couldn't get the words out and God still moved. And see, sometimes he'll give you that. Sometimes he'll take away the thing, but sometimes he'll give you the grace to work through it. And sometimes he'll work with you in spite of it, because again, his strength is made perfect in our weakness. So sometimes you'll walk into a thing and it'll fix the whole situation. But sometimes you'll walk into it and he will be greater than the weakness in your life, and he will be stronger than it. And we see that's what happened with Moses, because I don't know if Moses' stutter went away, but I know that it stopped limiting him at some point. Because one of my favorite things about the story is that we see it start in Exodus chapter 3. That means that Exodus chapter 1 and 2 were the ones that dealt with his failures. But Exodus is a big book. There's a lot more chapters. And the story of Moses' life really doesn't begin at the point of failure. The story of Moses' life, all of that's just a prelude. It begins in chapter 3, really, because that's where we see the ministry develop. And we look at what God did through that, because God answered every single one of Moses' excuses through his life. We look at the first part of it, he was limited because he said, God, who am I? My failures, all of this stuff, I can't do it. But the second part of his life was so much more important. Because again, 2 chapters devoted to Moses' failures. The rest of the book of Exodus and the rest of the books of law, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all about Moses and all of the things that he did, the great things, and that part of his life where he led the people. So the part of his life that we remember when we say Moses, we remember the parting of the Red Seas, we remember the time in the wilderness, we remember the strong leader. We don't always remember the guy who messed up in Egypt, because the second part of his life was greater. We look in the next one. Moses said, God, I don't know whose authority this is. How are they going to know it's you? How do I know it's you? But because of Moses, not only he learned to trust, but the people established a relationship with God that they'd never really had before. There was a priesthood that was established out of that, where the people, again, were represented to God, where they heard the voice of God, where they saw him move in tangible ways that they'd never really seen before. God, I think all those years in slavery, all those years being told, oh, you're less than human, you're not worthy of anything, and to hold on to your faith through that. And then suddenly, because Moses comes, and because of that moment, they begin to see this God we've been serving, there's something in it. We've just been living completely by faith and on a promise and nothing more, but now we're seeing the evidence. Because of what Moses did, because he walked into that, he let himself be called out of darkness and into light. The people learned that God could be everything they needed. And then Moses, the third fear again was response, and how are they going to act? Well, they were disgruntled, they doubted him. Moses still led the people. They didn't always do what he wanted them to do, but they respected his authority. Because despite all of the issues, they considered Moses a great leader. Moses was beloved for years to come. Even though there were moments, that fear of response, God answered that. And then when we look at Moses, we don't really think of him as a guy who had troubles with speaking. As a matter of fact, Moses wrote, Moses spoke. Moses was the mouthpiece of God in so many occasions. So his inabilities are not really the things that we remember. In the end of his life, God looked past all that and empowered Moses to deliver. And I love this. You see kind of the evidence of Moses' impact in the book of Joshua, where God calls Joshua at the end of Moses' life. He says, Moses, my servant, is dead. Arise, go over the Jordan, thou and all these people, into the land which I give to you, even unto the children of Israel. Of all the titles God could have given Moses, he called him my servant. That, again, if you look at the end of it, what we hope to hear is where God will say, well done, not good and faithful superstar, not good and faithful orator, nothing else, good and faithful servant. It's the highest honor you can be given in the kingdom of God, is that of a servant. And God called him Moses, my servant, because that's what God saw in the end. That was the label. Because Moses was called out of something and into something. And because of that, he defined it. I don't know, everybody has a story of how they come to church and how they come into the church. But what it comes down to, I think, really is just in that definition of church. The word church comes from a Greek word, ecclesia, which in Spanish we call it iglesia, which just means the called out one. It's a group of people who were called out. I think that defines it so well. Because wherever you came, the fact of the matter is you're sitting here right now. Whatever you were called out of, Whether some of us have these big stories of major things that God called us from. Some of us, it was just listening to that voice and following it. But you were called. There's a reason. He guided everything before, and he's guiding it now, and he's still with you. Can we go ahead and stand? There's a reason you're here. God has a plan and a purpose still. He's still calling. And just to give you encouragement, he calls you, and he hears the prayers that you pray for everybody else. He's never stopped calling. He does it all the time. Because we're chosen, we're royal, we're called out. That's an awesome thing. Can we worship God tonight?